that. It's not exactly how I would put it, but we understand each other. So there we go. Next question. Scott Ritter was in Irkutsk, saying that they are not longing for the USSR to come back, but rather for Tsarist Imperial Russia. What are your thoughts on that? Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. One of my thoughts is you have to remember that, Scott Ritter is a conservative. He's a Ronald Reagan Republican, and I think they know that, right? And that, when they're meeting with this American who is anti-imperialist and taking good anti-imperialist positions, and they know that he's a strong anti-communist, they're probably not going to emphasize Soviet nostalgia to that guy. You know what I mean? That's one thing, right? And that the other thing is that Tsarist nostalgia, number one, and Soviet nostalgia kind of walk hands in hand. It's the Donetsk People's Republic. It's the Lugansk People's Republic, right? So these are communist names. But if you look at the flags that they've chosen, they all have the Tsarist eagle on them, that's the eagle of the Tsar, right? And that, especially if you study Alexander Dugin, and he's a very important thinker in Russia who I am not ashamed to have met with, right? I am very proud to have met with him. I'm very proud to have met with his daughter on many occasions before she was brutally murdered. It was horrific what was done to his daughter. It was a crime. And the way the left on Twitter celebrated it, because, I didn't know who she was, but she's bad. I mean, unbelievable. Ben Norton can go to hell the way he celebrated Dari Dugan's death. That's a sick, evil person, Ben Norton, pretending to be an anti-imperialist. He celebrated her murder. He should be ashamed of himself. Dari Dugan was a great woman, one of the nicest people, one of the smartest people. She's much younger than I am, but so well-read. She knew Marxism. She knew anarchism. I had a long chat with her about George Sorel one time. I mean, she knew politics better than anybody. She could speak English. She could speak Russian, obviously, her native language. She could speak French. She'd studied in Paris as a student. She knew philosophy. Her views may not have been mine, but the way she was murdered, brutally murdered by the Ukrainian fascists, just a brutal assassination. And it was just awful. But anyway, you read Alexander Dugin, you read a lot of the Russian geopolitical analysts, when they talk about Russian empire, right? And it's very similar in China, right? They're talking to the geopolitical reality, which is that part of the world, Eurasia, where you have big land masses, right? You don't have, just direct access to the ocean. You have big land masses, right? People have been living in Eurasia together for thousands and thousands of years. The United States, it was about, 400 years ago that white people showed up and started, colonizing and being settlers here in the United States. And before that, it was just the Native Americans that were here. But these people in Eurasia, they, in Central Asia, in China, in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, in Iran, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, countries like that, those folks have been living next to each other for thousands and thousands, for like 5,000 years they've been living next to each other, okay? There's a lot of history there, right? History in the United States, obviously, it's pretty offensive that we don't keep track of the Native American history, but the continent, the political history of the United States starts like 400 years ago. The political history of Eurasia starts 5,000 years ago, okay? The history of China, the history of Russia, the history of Persia, Iran, you're talking thousands of years here, okay? And if you look over the history of those thousands of years people have been living together, things have been better in those parts of the world when people have been unified. When different regions have been unified, right? When the land surrounding the Soviet Union was unified, things were getting better. Roads got built, education increased, technological advancement went up. You had an advance. And when things were bad, people were all fighting each other, right? The history of China, what they call the century of humiliation in China, they describe it. Deng Xiaoping says China was like a heap of loose sand. Tibet was being run by the Dalai Lama. Hong Kong was a British protectorate. The the central government, the emperor, didn't even have control over a lot of areas because of the warlords. There were these warlords that didn't recognize it, right? And China, during the time that it was kept poor, was heavily divided. And the reason the Communist Party is loved and the reason the Qing dynasty is loved in China is because they brought one China together. And the reason the Soviet Union is admired even by many conservatives in Russia who are very anti-communist is because they recognize that just like Ivan the Terrible brought together all of those regions and built them up, times were better when they were together. Right? And so a lot of what they call about they talk about Russian nationalism. Right? And Lenin wrote a very famous essay about this, about how even the communists believe in great Russian patriotism. I'll pull this essay up. It's a very good essay that Lenin wrote about great Russian national pride. Right? That a lot of people in Russia and the surrounding countries, not just Russia, but the surrounding countries of that part of the world, understand when looking at the history of that region that life was better when they were together. And some of those people are communists who say life was better when it was the Soviet Union, and some of those people are very conservative. And I hope this is answering your question, Johnny. Some of those people are very conservative, but they just say, look, historically in Ukraine, things were good when Ukraine and Russia and Moldova and Latvia and Lithuania, when we were all together and we were raising our people up, life was better. And that is just, if you are just a pure nationalist, you recognize that. But if you're not a communist, right, if you see things more from a geopolitical perspective or an orthodox conservative perspective, that's very big in Russia now. Orthodox conservatism is a very big trend in Russia.